Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. Today my guest is Matt Dubroff, who's been studying the Alexander Technique teacher for 27 years and became a teacher of the technique in 2002. He's also a professor of theater at Hampton-Sydney College in Farmville, Virginia, and specializes in Asian theater. He also gives private Alexander technique lessons at that location. And to the point of what we're going to talk about today, he is a practitioner of the Wu style of Tai Chi Chuan and has been teaching that for 16 years. And we're going to talk a little about how the technique can help with Tai Chi and maybe how Tai Chi could help students and teachers of the Alexander technique. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Well, it's good talking to you. Could you begin by giving our listeners a very short description or definition of the Alexander technique?
Absolutely. I usually make it personal because that's where it all began with me. In that I find the Alexander technique is one of the best methods of dealing with life's habits. And it's one of the most potent and effective techniques I've come across for addressing your habits of, as an Alexander person might say, your habits of use, but that it happens to be you could be your mental habits or your physical habits or your psychophysical habits, as the case may be.
So really, any habits you have that you have a sense might be getting in the way, Alexander technique's a good way to deal with that, right?
To deal with that, and as you're on the path with Alexander, if you become aware of a habit, it might be that you become aware of a good habit, and you choose to reinforce that one as well.
Of course,
and
yeah.
That awareness is valuable too. It's not just about getting rid of habits.
Right. And it's interesting to me that you've been teaching Tai Chi a little longer, it seems, than you've been teaching the Alexander technique. So, but you were involved with the technique before starting to teach Tai Chi, right? Or you
Yeah,
had
I
some.
had a very intense Alexander exposure in college. First in my sophomore year, and then over the course of my senior year, I basically I had lessons 4 days a week for my entire senior year of college. That's a lot of Alexander lessons, private lessons.
Wow, yeah.
And it was a pretty unique circumstance that allowed that to happen. And then graduation happened and life happened. And I knew I wanted to be an Alexander technique teacher at some point, but there was a lot of living between my intense college experience and when I got to be near a training school where I could actually train. And along the way, I started studying Tai Chi. So then I had I went to the graduate school at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, and I was studying Asian theater there. And part of our graduate studies was to do some Asian movement and some Asian performance movement and some Asian performance singing. And I happened upon a Tai Chi teacher. So that's I studied with Patricia Liang, who is my Lao She, which is Chinese for teacher, in Hawaii, and I studied with her for 3 years.
So,
That's why it sort of leapfrogs from exposure to teaching and so on and so forth.
so just a sort of a very general question that would be, how do you see Tai Chi and Alexander technique relating to each other?
I think with any of the modalities that we all deal with, massage therapy, yoga, Tai Chi, any of the martial arts, all of the stuff, Traeger, etc. There's a connection between the notion of awareness. Everyone that's sort of your ground. And with Tai Chi, you have to be working from an area of awareness, and with Alexander technique, I think without awareness, you're in the dark. So that's where the connection happens, and then the learning process is very different from Tai Chi, in my experience, from Tai Chi to Alexander, in that Tai Chi is a lot of set patterns that you learn, patterns of movement, whereas Alexander is not that. But as you are learning these patterns of movement, you come up against your personal, and I come back to it. You come up against your personal habits. If you're holding yourself improperly in a Tai Chi position, a good teacher will start to point that out to you, and ideally learn how to make a different choice and get the proper position for Tai Chi.
Mm-hmm. So, but Alexander, as you say, doesn't really deal with positions particularly, or even what activities you're doing, but is more a way to learn how to do anything in a better way, right?
Yeah, and actually, now the way you phrase that actually comes back to the more advanced levels, perhaps of Tai Chi. Once you get past the basic forms of it, a teacher will say everything is Tai Chi. All movement is Tai Chi. So once again, I think it comes back to this notion of awareness. Once that is going, that carries through. It's not like you stop being aware when you stop doing any of your form practices, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Tai Chi has a really wonderful organizational principle as well, which a very strong organizational principle, which I think you can see in the Alexander technique, obviously with the classic notion of directions.
Mm-hmm.
Tai Chi doesn't necessarily put them into those terms, but the basic, there's a notion of use when you are doing Tai Chi. Of using yourself well as you go through the various positions. So it's one thing to raise your arm, and then you can raise your arm poorly and you can raise your arm well. And the Tai Chi is looking for a certain level of, if you will, efficiency. It puts that of use out there.
And typically in Tai Chi, let's say you are not raising your arm well. Would the usual solution be that the teacher might guide your arm or ask you to imitate his or her movements, that sort of thing? Or would there be the kind of mental self-directing that we tend to associate with the Alexander technique, directions and so on?
Well, let's keep in mind that when I was learning Tai Chi, I was already, I'd say, fairly connected with Alexander work.
Right.
And I was thinking about this, that as I was learning Tai Chi, I perhaps had an advantage over other students who had no training in anything. They were just coming in first class. And I had no martial arts training prior to this, but I think the Alexander technique gave me a head start, if you will, on the learning process. I understood that there were the basic procedure that I was trained under was a teacher would show us a movement sequence 3 times, and then we would follow her 3 times. Nothing was spoken, and then she'd watch us, and we'd muddle through and make grand mistakes, and then there was a correction phase. If you're coming back to the raising an arm well or raising an arm, I'll say poorly, there's another training approach where as you're going through the form, a teacher might just say, now hold that position. So you've got 20 or 30 students in the classroom, and they all hold a position. If you are using yourself well, you can hold that position quite comfortably. If for example, your shoulders have come up as you've picked up your arm, you're going to get tired, and you might hold this for a few minutes as the teacher makes her way around, as my teacher made her way around, and did manipulate us into a better organization. So there was some contact. It wasn't extensive. It's not like a private lesson of an
Right,
Alexander
but the
lesson.
idea is if you're adding unnecessary tension, for example, to that act of lifting your arm, to take that as the example, the teacher, well, first of all, if you're doing that, it's going to be tough to keep your arm up for a long time.
Hmm.
And you'll notice that. And so I guess your attention will go to that whole issue. And then the teacher would come and with her hand, she would slightly readjust you. Is that how it would work?
Yeah, it would be a matter of just putting a hand on your shoulder, saying, let's. I don't know if she said let's let go of that. And there's a term I don't want to use too much lingo, but uh, Tai Chi and a lot of Chinese um, philosophy focuses on various energies of the body,
Hmm.
and Tai Chi has it is a martial art, so it has an explosive energy. It has a push, a ward off, various things, and one of the fundamental energies is one called Song. Um, which means and it never gets translated well because it is a different language at the end of the day. They usually say it means relax,
Hmm.
but they often demonstrate it and they say it's not collapse,
Hmm.
it's this, and then they'd show somebody who was exhibiting good use, general
Right,
general efficient use. So
right.
it's really one of the fundamental energies of Tai Chi is to have your body be in a state that's efficiently functioning for whatever position you happen to be in, which to my mind sounds very much like Alexander work.
Right. And so the advantage that you had going into that Tai Chi learning experience was that you, like, if you raised your arm and it didn't seem good, you had some internal directions you could give yourself that would help
Absolutely.
you to move it more easily. And
Abs-
yeah, and
Very
and
much so.
and
And
that's
yeah, go
not
ahead.
what the other people in the class had. They probably, I assume, depended on the instructor to reposition them, call their attention to something they might be doing, but not necessarily giving them an overall strategy for dealing with that kind of excess tension. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, definitely not a total tonal assessment or mechanism as the Alexander technique does work with.
Right.
Yeah, it might have been a little more piecemeal than that. I think the end goal of Tai Chi is very similar, and you're working towards a totality of use that translates through the entire body. But perhaps the pedagogy, Tai Chi pedagogy, hasn't caught up there.
Well, it's a different kind of a pedagogy. I mean, I can remember learning Qigong, a short Qigong form many years ago that was taught exactly the way you described. The teacher would
Hmm.
do it several times, class would do it, he'd watch, and then he'd come around and make tiny little suggestions. He was almost everything you learned, it seemed like you learned from imitation or observation and imitation.
Which is very valuable. I think our culture has a maverick sensibility about it,
Hmm.
where the monkey see, monkey do is somewhat discredited. But I think there is a certain value, and maybe that's my connection, all my connections with the various Asian art forms that I work with, and the distance I've traveled with that. Um, Bringing also my sensibilities that I've developed over the years, coming back to the if you get held during a Tai Chi class, if you get held in a excuse me for a second, if you get held in a position, you I found myself using that as an opportunity to use my Alexander directions and really reinforce them in while I was in a certain position.
So, I guess one message we could put out there is if you are studying or training in the area of Tai Chi, or I would imagine pretty much any martial art, that Alexander technique could be a way to help you overcome obstacles. Would that be a fair statement, do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. The Another thing the Alexander technique does, I find, is it gives you a more accurate sensibility of even just when you look at somebody raise your arm, because you've been looking at how if you have the Alexander training, you've been looking at how movement happens a
Hmm.
lot of times. You can more accurately on the first go around when you're in the imitation mode.
Hmm.
You can I feel I again was able to imitate more accurately.
Yes, I could see that absolutely. So, but now looking at things from the other direction, what would you say that some training in Tai Chi, or perhaps more generally a martial art, would be? How might that be helpful for someone who is either teaching or studying the Alexander technique?
So I guess the question you're asking is what could a Tai Chi teacher bring to an Alexander lesson?
Yes, yes. Hmm.
Um, uh, it's sort of approaching from the flip side of the coin. If use, as Alexander would say, if use affects functioning, this is functioning can affect use.
Hmm.
So when you're doing the Alexander technique, you're functioning. I mean, I'm sorry. When you're doing Tai Chi, you are functioning,
Right.
and and ideally you have good use as you're doing it. So if you're when you work when I've done this a little bit when I work with Alexander students, I can approach them, put hands on them in a different way. I actually do a lot of this, and I exert a certain degree of pressure on a student, which to some degree makes them use themselves differently.
Hmm.
If that makes sense,
Sure. Yep.
it's um, the after you've been training with Tai Chi for some time, you get into an area of it's not quite sparring. Sparring is actual martial techniques, but as a half step towards that, there's something called push hands, Tuisho,
Hmm.
and Tuisho really gets you to pit your functioning against somebody else's
Hmm.
functioning,
Hmm.
and much in the same way I can approach as a Tai Chi teacher. I can bring that sensibility to how I work with an Alexander student and check on their use through fairly, if you're used to standard Alexander, if I may, a light touch
Hmm.
or very delicate hands,
Hmm.
I can actually put a little force into a student's body and communicate with them that way.
So you're, in a sense, getting at the task of improving their use by giving them a direct experience of better functioning.
That very much so, and
Yeah.
it really deals with their structure has to wake up to the force that I'm putting into them,
Hmm.
and the force I put into them has to come out of me in a clean manner through a Tai Chi structure myself.
Hmm.
Yeah, I guess my organization is speaking to their organization, if that
Right,
makes sense.
right. And as you say, that's a somewhat different way of using for an Alexander teacher to use their hands than you typically see in a Alexander lesson. But what you're saying is, in this case, if you're working with someone with Tai Chi, that has an appropriateness that it might not have elsewhere.
So that's me as a Tai Chi using my Tai Chi skills, my Tai Chi abilities as a teacher of the Alexander technique to
Right.
give an Alexander student a Tai Chi lesson or exercise. I haven't done that so much, although there are certain positions of Tai Chi that we use in Alexander all the time.
Like
Most notably
monkey.
is monkey a little bit, but really the lunge.
Oh, the
Um,
lunge.
and
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and that is my style of Tai Chi is lunge intensive,
Hmm. Hmm.
so that when I was as a teacher, when I was training to be a teacher, and we got introduced to a lunge, I was like, oh. this is just like Tai Chi.
Hmm.
so
Right,
so
right.
it was that activity was very native to me already, as a result of my Tai Chi training. So that would be something that would be of use for out of the Tai Chi movement patterns would be of great use to a student, I would think.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an analogy to what you're describing, using your Tai Chi knowledge to help someone. I would think maybe, say, if you had an Alexander teacher who was also a singing teacher, they might work with a student, even who's not a vocal student, but might work with their voice in a more direct way, in addition to the Alexander overall way of working with people. I
Absolutely,
mean,
and with Alexander work, it becomes a matter of, and I return to the notion of habits. If somebody has never done Tai Chi before, then in fact Tai Chi becomes wonderful because it's a fresh playing field through which to explore. Um,
hmm
so
hmm
whereas if when you're working with somebody who's sitting in a chair, that's wonderful as well. But then their habits are their habits of history of use is most evident. Whereas with if you give them some Tai Chi postures, there's an area of exploration that could be a clean slate for them to begin with,
Oh,
or
that's an
perhaps
that.
if you will, a
Mhm.
cleaner slate.
Oh, that's a very interesting idea. So there could be an advantage in someone. So you might even teach someone a few simple Tai Chi uh, moves or postures, not so much to teach them Tai Chi, but to give them, as you say, a fresh platform for learning basic Alexander ideas.
Yeah, and in my work, because of the range of things that I'm involved with, I've maintained as much as possible actually a fairly discrete sensibility between when I'm teaching Tai Chi, when I'm teaching Alexander. I have not felt inclined to do this so much, except for how I use myself. But that's on me, not on
Hmm.
the student
Right.
so much. Although if I did this when I was training because I had my Tai Chi work already, and then when it was time for me to train as a teacher of the Alexander technique, a significant part of my private lessons during that time were spent because I had access to teachers finally. I spent a lot of time with my teachers going through the form and having them do Alexander work with me as I was doing the Tai Chi.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I was to a certain extent relearning Tai Chi with an actual Alexander person present, rather than when I was learning Tai Chi the first time and I was going on my experiences
Hmm.
from my Alexander exposure.
Right.
So,
Right. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention before we come to an end?
just with regards to Tai Chi and the Alexander technique, I think they play together very well. There are a lot of connections that are great fun to explore, and um, I know some people get frustrated with the Alexander technique in at times. This is depending on the teacher and the student, etc. That it can be fairly in and out of the chair, walking, lying down,
Hmm.
and maybe a whispered ah here and there. It can become
Right.
quite
Standard procedures,
standard
basically.
procedures.
Yeah.
And Tai Chi is such a wonderful active mode that still I feel the principles are right there all the time as you're working with, or for me anyway, as I'm working with my Tai Chi. It's a wonderful opportunity to have bring both together,
Oh,
both action and Alexander principles.
okay. I think that's a great place to end our conversation. My guest today has been Matt Dubroff, who is an Alexander Technique teacher. He's also a practitioner and teacher of Tai Chi. He's a professor of theater at Hampton-Sydney College in Farmville, Virginia, and he's available for teaching Alexander Technique lessons there. And thank you so much for being on the show, Matt.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, yeah.